All right, let's jump right into it. Have you ever thought about something as, well, seemingly simple as a self-driving car needing to make a left turn against traffic?
Yeah, it sounds tiny, doesn't it? Just one car, one little maneuver.
Exactly. But then you zoom out, you're not designing for one car, you're designing for a whole fleet. Millions of them maybe, making millions of these turns.
And that tiny risk on that specific turn, the chance of an accident, however small it starts to aggregate, across the whole fleet, over time, it adds up.
Suddenly you're looking at, well, actual numbers, expected injuries, statistically significant ones.
Right. And what looked like just a driving choice, it suddenly becomes this really fundamental trade-off that's being literally programmed into the technology.
Safety versus mobility, basically.
Precisely. You could tell the car, okay, always go around the block, avoid the risky left turn. Super safe, but slower, less convenient.
Or you program it to be, I don't know, more assertive, zip through smaller gaps, you boost efficiency, sure, but you're accepting that higher aggregate risk.
These aren't just technical settings, they are value choices. We're baking values into the code, and that's going to shape how we all move around.
So the question becomes, how do we even decide what the right balance is? I mean, what level of risk is okay for the sake of convenience? Not just for my car, but for everyone sharing the road.
That's the core problem.
Yeah.
And traditionally, when we face these kinds of ethical tech questions, there are things like algorithmic bias, people tend to look in two main directions for answers.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, there's individual moral philosophy, trying to apply theories, like utilitarianism, maximizing the good, or deontology, following duties to figure out the right action.
Makes sense. What should the car do?
Right. But moral theories, while vital for personal ethics, kind of hit a wall when you're designing systems for millions. For one thing, there's no single moral theory everyone just agrees on.
Yeah, philosophers haven't exactly settled that one yet.
Not quite. And even if they had, just figuring out the right answer from a theory doesn't fully respect individual agency. People have different values, different priorities. A collective system needs to somehow account for that.
So, my self-driving car.
Yeah.
Am I okay with it following some grand population level optimum if I really just want it to prioritize my safety above all else right now?
Exactly. That tension between the individual and the collective becomes very, very real.
Okay, so that's one approach. What's the other?
The other path is turning to social science, empirical data. Let's just study how people actually behave, survey their preferences, see what trade-offs they make in the real world.
That sounds more practical, maybe. Build tech based on what people seem to want or do.
It definitely gives you crucial information. It maps the terrain, but it's also not enough on its own. Social science can reveal really problematic patterns.
How so?
Well, studies have shown, for instance, that human drivers are sometimes more likely to yield at crosswalks for certain kinds of people than others. You don't want to just automate existing biases because they show up in the data.
Oh, absolutely not. That's a huge pitfall. Just because a bias exists doesn't mean we should hard code it into our future.
Precisely. And even setting aside bias, empirical data doesn't tell us how to resolve disagreements when people genuinely want conflicting things from the tech.
Like the safety versus convenience trade-off again.
Yeah, or think about self-interest. Someone might say in a survey, oh yes, self-driving cars should prioritize pedestrians. But maybe, deep down, they're really hoping their car will protect them in a crunch.
How do you weigh those conflicting desires? Who gets to decide which preference wins? Does a simple majority vote make it legitimate to force a certain behavior?
You've nailed it. Standard moral philosophy struggles with collective agreement and agency in a system. Social science gives us data, sometimes uncomfortable data about biases and conflicts, but no rule book for resolving those conflicts or building fair collective rules.
So it feels like neither approach, just by itself, really gives us the tools we need for these big, messy collective decisions about technology.
That's exactly the argument our sources are making. They suggest we've been asking the wrong primary question in tech ethics. We've focused too much on what should an individual or a system do in scenario X, which is really about individual morality.
Okay, so what should we be asking?
We desperately need to ask, what makes for good policies, good systems, good institutions that govern how technology operates for all of us? And that question, they argue, belongs squarely in the realm of political philosophy.
Okay. So this is the new lens. Moving from the individual, what should I do, to the collective, how should we design and govern this system?
You got it. Political philosophy offers tools and concepts specifically developed for thinking about decisions that affect us as a society, as a collective, operating within shared systems.
And we've got some really interesting sources that dig into this. One makes that broad case why tech ethics needs more political philosophy, and another gets really specific, applying these ideas directly to fairness in machine learning.
Yeah, so our mission here in this deep dive is to unpack why this shift matters, from the purely individual ethical lens to a more collective political one. And then what concrete insights political philosophy, especially ideas from egalitarianism, can actually offer for building fairer tech.
All right, let's dig into what political philosophy actually brings to the table here. Our sources point to three key ideas it forces us to confront, ideas often missed in those more individual-focused debates.
Okay, the first one is acknowledging what's called reasonable pluralism. Political philosophy starts from the basic fact that in any free society, people are going to disagree about important values. And often, they have perfectly good, reasonable grounds for their disagreements, based on different experiences, beliefs, ways of life.
So disagreement isn't just noise to be filtered out.
Exactly. Pluralism isn't a bug. It's a feature of a free society. And collective decision-making, like how we govern AI, needs to find ways to work despite these deep, reasonable disagreements. It's not always about finding the one right answer everyone accepts.
It's more about finding ways to live together, make decisions together, even when we have different fundamental values.
Precisely. It's about finding legitimate and stable ways forward in the face of enduring disagreement. That's the first thing. The second is this constant tension between collective values and individual agency or autonomy.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Even if we, as a community, decide something is generally good or bad, say, promoting safety on the roads, political philosophy asks, okay, how should we regulate that? How much freedom should individuals still have within that collective goal? The system's rules don't necessarily need to dictate every single choice someone makes.
So it's like the difference between me deciding, is it morally okay for me to share this controversial article, versus us deciding, how should we design platform rules about content moderation that balance free speech and preventing harm?
That's a perfect example. It shifts the frame. And the third core concern is legitimate authority.
Meaning, who gets to make the rules?
Yes, and why should we follow them? Political philosophy digs into questions like, why are we obligated to obey collective decisions? Who has the right to create rules that significantly impact people's lives, their opportunities, their basic goods? What's being regulated, who's doing the deciding, and how they're deciding? All of that is crucial for whether authority is seen as legitimate.
This feels incredibly relevant when you think about, say, big tech companies. Who decided the values embedded in the algorithm that runs my newsfeed or the risk assessment tool a bank uses?
Exactly. Is it just the company because they built the tech?
Yeah.
Should government step in? Should the public have more of a direct say?
Especially when these systems act like essential infrastructure now, right? Gatekeepers to information, jobs, loans.
Right. When private entities create systems that distribute public goods or opportunities on a massive scale, questions about their authority become really pressing. Political philosophy suggests that decisions impacting these fundamental public interests might require more democratic grounding, whether that's through regulation, public consultation, participatory design, something.
So political philosophy kind of pulls us away from those maybe slightly artificial dilemmas like the classic trolley problem. You know, the car has to hit someone. Who does it choose?
It moves beyond just that moment of crisis.
And forces us to ask bigger questions. How do we design the system, the roads, the sensors, the rules to minimize those horrible choices in the first place? And how do we, as a community with all our diverse values, decide how the benefits and potential harms of technology get distributed?
That's the shift in perspective. Those trolley cases are useful for probing individual moral intuition, sure, but political philosophy broadens the lens to the system, the collective, the governance structures.
And these concerns, pluralism, agency, legitimacy, they obviously go way beyond just self-driving cars. They apply across the board in AI ethics.
Absolutely. Think about all the AI ethics principles being published. How well do they actually handle value differences across cultures? How do they respect individual choice when AI systems make decisions about people? And who ensures the developers deploying powerful AI actually have the legitimate authority to make choices with such huge societal impacts?
So adopting this lens means what, practically?
It means actively looking for common ground, even when we disagree. It means building mechanisms to actually incorporate and resolve conflicting values, not just assuming one size fits all. It means thinking twice before just replacing human judgment everywhere. It means prioritizing the interests of the people most affected when designing big systems. And it means pushing for more democratic or participatory ways to make decisions when tech impacts public goods.
Okay, that lays out a compelling case for why we need this political philosophy perspective in tech ethics. Now, let's get more specific. How does this apply to something really concrete, like fairness in machine learning? Our sources dive right into this.
Yeah, this is where it gets fascinating because debates in algorithmic fairness often directly mirror philosophical debates that have been going on for centuries, especially within egalitarian thought.
So machine learning models are making decisions about people all the time, right? Loans, job ads, insurance rates.
Exactly. These aren't trivial things. They distribute opportunities where they can create barriers. So naturally, people worry, are these systems fair? Especially since they can easily pick up and even amplify existing societal biases hidden in the data they're trained on.
And this field of fair machine learning tries to tackle that, to detect and fix these biases. But as our sources really emphasize, just defining what fair means mathematically in a way you can code, that turns out to be incredibly difficult.
Oh, it's super complex. You end up with this whole alphabet soup of different proposed fairness metrics. Things like disparate impact, trying to get similar selection rates for different groups, or accuracy equity, wanting the model to be equally accurate for everyone.
There's equality of opportunity too, right? Making sure people who qualify have the same chance regardless of group.
Yep. And disparate mistreatment, aiming for equal error rates, like false positives or false negatives across groups. And even counterfactual fairness, asking, would this person's outcome change only if we change their group membership, keeping everything else identical?
Okay, lots of ways to define it. But here's where, as you said, it gets really interesting, maybe even paradoxical. The sources point out that you can't always have it all.
That's a crucial, often counterintuitive finding. Some of these metrics that all sound good, like wanting equal accuracy and equal false positive rates, turns out mathematically you often cannot satisfy them both at the same time.
Unless the underlying situation is already perfectly equal, which it rarely is.
Exactly. If the base rates of whatever you're predicting, like loan repayment, are actually different between groups in the real world, often due to historical reasons, then optimizing for one kind of mathematical fairness metric frequently makes another one worse.
Which forces a choice. Developers have to decide which definition of fairness they're going to prioritize.
And that choice isn't just technical. It's fundamentally a value choice, often with significant collective consequences. Which brings us right back to needing a deeper framework than just the math.
So the technical work itself surfaces these deep philosophical questions.
Right. Which idea of fairness is the right one for, say, a credit scoring model versus a hiring algorithm versus a medical diagnostic tool? Should models even be allowed to use certain characteristics, even if they predict well? Are we trying to equalize final outcomes or just the initial opportunity? How do we handle these trade-offs when one fairness goal conflicts with another? These are precisely the kinds of questions philosophers, especially egalitarians, have grappled with for ages.
Okay, egalitarianism. The basic idea that people should be treated as equals and things like opportunities or goods should be distributed fairly. How do the different strands of egalitarian thinking map onto these ML fairness debates?
Well, one big debate within egalitarianism is about the currency of justice. What is it exactly that we should be trying to make equal?
Like, what's the stuff we're distributing fairly?
Yeah. Is it welfare, like people's happiness or life satisfaction? Is it resources, the things like income, wealth, concrete opportunities? Or is it capabilities, what people are actually able to do and be like being healthy, being educated, participating in society, even if their resources differ?
Okay, 3 different potential targets for equality. How does that connect to ML?
Well, ML models often directly affect the distribution of resources, loans, jobs, housing ads. They can also indirectly affect capabilities like access to good information, healthcare, or education. Thinking about which currency is most relevant for a specific AI application helps clarify what kind of fairness we should even be aiming for.
Are we trying to make sure everyone gets the same amount of stuff, resources, or are we trying to make sure everyone has the ability to achieve certain things, capabilities, maybe by compensating for disadvantages?
Exactly. It also pushes back against a common, maybe implicit assumption in some ML fairness work that everyone values the outcome the same way, which, isn't always true in real life. Different people might prioritize different things.
That makes a lot of sense. And another concept from political philosophy that seems relevant is the idea of spheres of justice.
Absolutely. Philosophers like Michael Walzer argue that different areas of social life, different spheres, have their own internal logic when it comes to fairness.
Give me an example.
Okay, so in the sphere of citizenship, the logic is usually strict equality. One person, one vote. Political power should be equal. But in the economic sphere, we often accept some inequality of outcome, provided there was fair opportunity, maybe based on merit or effort. The logic is different.
So applying that to AI, a fairness metric that makes sense for, say, hiring, where maybe you're focused on equal opportunity given qualifications, that same metric might be totally wrong for an algorithm deciding how to distribute scarce medical resources like vaccines.
Precisely. In the medical case, the relevant principle might be need, or maybe strict equality, or some other logic specific to that sphere of health. You can't just pick a fairness metric off the shelf without considering the social context, the sphere the algorithm is operating in. It tells you which underlying philosophical principle of fairness you should be trying to capture.
Okay, another huge debate in egalitarianism you mentioned is about luck versus desert. When are inequalities okay and when are they unjust?
Right. This is the luck egalitarian perspective. They argue, roughly, that inequalities are only fair if they result from factors people can be held responsible for, like their voluntary choices or calculated risks. But inequalities stemming from brute luck, things totally outside their control, like the family they were born into, genetic predispositions, or just sheer random accidents, those are unfair. And society has a reason to try and mitigate them.
And this connects directly to which features you allow in an ML model, right?
Hugely. Think about risk scoring systems again. Is it fair to use features that are correlated with things like race or socioeconomic background, even if they're statistically predictive, like using zip code, which might correlate strongly with race and income due to historical segregation?
A luck egalitarian might say.
They might argue that if that zip code reflects disadvantages stemming from systemic injustice or lack of opportunity, essentially, bad brute luck, then using it to penalize someone with a worse score or higher insurance premium is fundamentally unfair. We hold people responsible for their choices, maybe, but not for the circumstances they were born into.
But that gets tricky too, doesn't it? Critics point out that drawing a clean line between choice and circumstance is hard.
It's very hard. And some argue that even inequalities resulting from choices might warrant societal intervention sometimes. What if someone makes a choice that's socially valuable but low-paying, like becoming a teacher or a caregiver? Are the resulting economic disadvantages always fair? It raises deep questions about the limits of individual responsibility, especially when choices themselves are made under constrained circumstances. This whole debate just shows the philosophical depth hidden inside the technical question of which features are okay to use.
It sounds like you can't just look at the inequality itself. You need to understand how it came about.
Exactly. And that brings us to deontic justice. This perspective focuses less on the pattern of distribution itself and more on the causal history. How did this inequality arise? What actions, policies, or historical processes produced the current state of affairs?
So it's not just that one group has lower scores in the data, but why? What historical or systemic factors led to that?
Precisely. It pushes you to bring in history, sociology, economics to understand the mechanisms that created the patterns you see in the data. The unfairness of a biased loan algorithm, from this view, isn't just that it's inaccurate, it's that the inaccuracy reflects and potentially perpetuates harms caused by a history of discriminatory practices that generated the biased data in the first place. It emphasizes understanding the process.
That perspective really forces you to look beyond the dataset itself, to the wider social system that produced it, which I imagine helps in deciding which disparities are the most unjust or urgent to address.
Definitely. And finally, there's a related but distinct idea: representative fairness. This isn't so much about distributing tangible goods or avoiding harms to specific individuals, but about how different groups, identities, or cultures are represented or misrepresented in our digital systems.
You mean like biases in large language models, where they learn stereotypes from the text data they're trained on and might associate certain jobs primarily with one gender?
Exactly that. Or think about image search results or recommendation systems. Are certain groups systematically underrepresented, made invisible, or portrayed through harmful stereotypes? The harm here isn't necessarily direct material harm to one person at one moment, but a kind of cultural or symbolic harm misrecognition, reinforcing prejudice at a societal level. Fairness here is about voice, visibility, and respectful representation.
Wow. Okay. So fair machine learning is,
Yikes.
it's definitely not just a technical problem you solve with a better algorithm or the right metric.
Not at all. It's deeply entangled with these complex, centuries-old philosophical debates about what equality even means, what justice demands, when inequality is okay, and what our responsibilities are to each other.
And current approaches in the field, as our sources suggest, often kind of paper over these deeper issues. They might default to technical fixes or just rely on legally protected categories.
Without always fully grappling with why those categories matter from a justice perspective, or which specific kind of fairness is the ethically right one for the job. Drawing on political philosophy gives us a much richer language, a better conceptual toolkit for asking these fundamental questions and navigating the unavoidable trade-offs.
It also really highlights the challenges, though. How do you actually translate abstract ideas like brute luck or capability into something you can measure in a data set, especially when the data itself might be a product of the very injustices you're trying to fix?
It absolutely underscores the difficulty. Achieving meaningful fairness in AI isn't just a data science problem. It's a profound socio-technical challenge and, yes, a philosophical one. It really demands collaboration across disciplines and a genuine willingness to wrestle with these deep ethical questions.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together then. We started this deep dive with that simple image, a self-driving car making a left turn, and sort of peeled back the layers.
Right, uncovering the complex value choices embedded in seemingly neutral tech. And we saw why the usual approaches, just individual moral theories or just looking at empirical data, kind of fall short for tackling these big collective decisions.
And then we saw how political philosophy offers this crucial alternative lens. It forces us to think about reasonable pluralism, how we live with disagreement. It highlights the tension between collective goals and individual agency, and it makes us ask hard questions about legitimate authority, who gets to decide.
Then diving into fairness in machine learning really brought it home. We saw how political philosophy, especially drawing on egalitarian debates, gives us these frameworks for thinking through the really tough trade-offs.
Yeah, like when different fairness metrics are mathematically incompatible, concepts like the currency of fairness, are we equalizing welfare, resources, or capabilities, the idea of different spheres of justice needing different fairness rules.
Understanding the role of luck versus desert. Thinking about the causal history with deontic justice. And considering representative fairness, too. These aren't just abstract ideas. They offer much more nuanced ways to approach algorithmic fairness than just tweaking the code.
And understanding this deeper philosophical background, it's not just for academics, right? It equips you, the listener, to look beyond the surface-level technical talk about biases and ask more fundamental questions.
Exactly. Questions about the kind of society we actually want to build with technology. What values are we truly embedding in these incredibly powerful systems that are reshaping our world?
So thinking about everything we've discussed, those inherent trade-offs like the clashing fairness metrics in ML, and this undeniable need for collective decisions about tech that somehow have to respect diverse values and individual agency, it leads to a final thought, maybe a challenge for all of us.
What new forms of governance, what new kinds of participatory processes might we actually need to invent or implement right now? How do we ensure that the authority, whether it's corporate or governmental, that's building and deploying these systems is truly legitimate, that it's genuinely responsive to the public good it's supposed to be serving?
It's a huge question. It really takes us beyond just the code, doesn't it? Right into the heart of how we govern ourselves in this technological age.